Did you know? It is estimated that Chinese investments in Zimbabwe from 2005 to 2019 are within the range of $9.82 billion. Of this, over $6 billion has been invested in mining and energy, a sector critical to the Zimbabwean economy and the achievement of Vision 2030. To meet its annual demand for copper, zinc, nickel, and a range of other raw materials, China now imports $100 billion worth of base metals every year, consuming more than 25% of the world's supplies. Furthermore, the Chinese economy absorbs 27% of the globe's iron and steel and 25% of its aluminium output. 5.4 plus million COVID-19 vaccines have been donated to Zimbabwe by China to help in combating the pandemic as an extension of assistance between trade partners. China has pledged more help.
The Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, in conjunction with the Africa Institute for Environmental Law, brings to you the Political Economy Dialogues on Natural Resource Governance, PEDNAG.
The Political Economy Dialogue on Natural Resource Governance is a space for all, a convening platform to confront and find policy solutions to governance challenges in Africa's natural resource sector. At ZELA, we believe that investments run without accountability and transparency do not contribute to sustainable development. Through this PEDNAG series, focusing on Chinese investments in Africa, we seek to foster corporate accountability and responsible investments in Africa's resource sector.
Get ready to learn more about climate change, energy consumption, local service delivery governance, responsible investments, and so much more. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode.
Thank you so much for making time for us to have this timely and important dialogue on Chinese investments in Africa's mining and energy sector. My name is Farai Shon Mutondoro, and I'm the coordinator for the Africa Institute for Environmental Law. And the Africa Institute for Environmental Law is the convener of this dialogue that we call the Political Economy Dialogue on Natural Resource Governance. So I think the framing of the dialogue and why we need to have dialogue on such issues relating to natural resource governance in Africa, I think it emanates from a realization that we need to do more in terms of policy reflections around the resource paradox issue. I think there is voluminous literature subscribing to issues around resource scarce and the governance challenges in Africa resource sector. But hardly are there opportunities for us to dialogue and reflect on what are some of the policy solutions for us to capitalize on trade and investment by whosoever is investing in the resource sector. So under ZELA, we have a Chinese investments program that we have and a Chinese investment strategy that we have. And the main objective of that work is to foster corporate accountability by Chinese investors in Africa. I think data confirms that China is Africa's main trading partner. Many Chinese are investing and the footprint is all over. You go to South Africa, you go to Nigeria, Zambia, come to Zim. I think there's a huge appetite for African products in terms of raw materials by Chinese investors. And I think the FOCAC makes it very clear that China has a long-term strategy to keep on investing in Africa. So that is why we then said, why can't we pilot test this whole idea of convening dialogues, a series of dialogues around Chinese investments in Africa? And the objective is not to say no to investments, but the main objective is how can we foster corporate accountability of Chinese investors investing in Africa's mining and energy sector. So today's dialogue is the second edition. We had one last week, 2 weeks ago, which was reflecting on the BRIC, which is China's Belt and Road Initiative, and what are some of the legal options for Africa to foster corporate accountability. Today we are back again, and I think the discussion topic is on Chinese investments in Africa's mining and energy sector. What are the policy implications for the Africa mining vision, and what can we learn from Sino-Latin relations? So I want to hand over to my colleague Thandazile, who is going to be the pilot and moderating this great session, to take over from here. So Thandazile, over to you.
Thank you very much, Farai. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session. And to set the scene, I'll just start by setting the scene. Actually, Farai, would you mind introducing the panelists first? Then I will start speaking to them.
Okay, great. Let me do that. So in terms of who are the key panelists that we have today, we have three panelists. We have Dr. Prolific Mataruse. Dr. Mataruse is with the University of Zimbabwe, and his research interest lies in areas like decolonial theory, community organizing, and the African political economy. Dr. Mataruse was a co-author in the China-Zimbabwe book that Zela commissioned in 2020, in last year. On the panel also have Titus Gwemende. Titus is an experienced development work leader with special interest in geopolitics and economics of energy and extractives in the region, in particular issues around the BRICS investments, international trade and climate change. He's currently engaged in research on the political economy of natural resource gas in Mozambique and decarbonization of mining within the SADC region. Titus Gwemende is with Oxfam International as the Southern Africa regional lead, focusing on natural resource governance. To reflect on Sino-Latin relations, we have Denise Lianis Suarez. She's an experienced socio-economic conflict resolution and social environment safeguard expert from Chile. Her work borders around engaging Chinese corporations, and currently she's studying law. She has a background in political science from, I cannot properly pronounce it, but it's Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, with studies on transformation of social environmental conflicts. So this is the panel that we have today. We'll glean from the regional and global experiences of Titus. We'll learn from the in-depth insights that Dr. Prolific gained as he was doing his 2 chapters for the Zela study, and the vast experience that Denise does bring in terms of engaging with Chinese corporations from the perspective of Sino-Latin relations. So this is the panel that we have, and the moderator is none other than Dr. Thandazile Moyo. She is a researcher with the Minerals to Metals initiatives under the University of Cape Town. Her background, she's a chemical engineer who is passionate about Africa's sustainable development and advancing the realization of sustainable development goals with focus through research and teaching. I know your particular interest is around urban mining and e-waste. I think that's the panel that we have for today, and I hope we'll get key insights from them. So Thandazile, over to you.
Thank you very much, Farai. So, ladies and gentlemen, considering the topic at hand, I figured I could start us off by just a brief overview of what the objectives of the Africa Mining Vision were, and use that to set our scene as we get into the insights that we will draw from our esteemed panelists. So the Africa Mining Vision, it's a Pan-African policy framework which was established through the combined networks of initiatives already in the regional scene and in the continental scene, as well as in the global scene, to actually come up with a policy that would drive a more inclusive extractive industry-led development. And when implemented, it's expected that it would yield transparent, equitable, and optimal exploitation of mineral resources to underpin broad-based sustainable growth and socio-economic development. So for those of you that might have read the AMV, you would know that that was verbatim from the AMV document. And since we know that this development framework is actually set in the bedrock of an enclave mining industry in Africa, And we know that this industry has actually not yielded the envisaged development that one would expect of such natural resources well-endowed continent. And some of the historic factors to consider when we're getting into this discussion, especially in terms of investment and ownership of mining enterprises in the continent. We know that in the 20th century, investment into Africa's mining sector was largely driven by the global north. They dominated the investments in the sector. And since then, as countries gained their independence and local government took over, like different host governments took over, we know that there's been some interludes where different states have increased their control of those natural resources through nationalization strategies. And this has since been followed by an increase in Chinese foreign direct investment into Africa, into exploration and mining in the African continent. And to kick us off with that as our backdrop, I'll actually start by asking Prolific to speak to what those transitions have meant, especially in the Zimbabwean context. So moving from era when the global north was the dominating investor in our mining sector to the time when we saw our government promote nationalization of those resources, and to an era now where we're seeing a growth in Chinese investments. How do you see this transition to have taken place, and how does that fit with perhaps some of the underlying objectives of the AMV? We know that the AMV was only unveiled in 2009, and if I'm not misinformed, we know that the first Chinese investment started sometime before that, with Sinotech taking over a mining site in South Africa, I think, a mining company in South Africa. So can you talk us through what that transition has meant and its contribution to realizing what the AMV stood for, or the country vision? You can speak to this from any level, Prolific.
Oh, thank you, Thandazile. Thank you so much. And I want to thank the colleagues as well that are participating today. I hope I'll be able to share with you some interesting things, some new things as well. Any discussion about China is in essence a discussion into identity politics and grand strategy. So those are important things to keep in mind: identity politics and grand strategy. So with identity politics, its ability obviously to include some sectors and its defect of excluding some actors. So these are some things that I will speak to as I'll be presenting today. So recently I've just been doing some reading, and I came across a particular quote from the poet Gwendolyn Bennett, who says, "Hating you shall be a game played with cool heads. Hating you shall be a game played with cool heads." So this is a statement that I think is so typical of identity politics. Usually it starts off with something as cool, but with cool heads, then eventually everything breaks out. I'm citing this in particular because of a prevalent perception in Zimbabwe from a great section of the populace that it's work that I've done elsewhere, people that have an anti-China perception, but it was not always like this. It was not always like this. When you read literature, you find that the Chinese have always been good friends of Zimbabwe. That's why the term "oh, we're the friends" really comes from the colonial times. It was there. So we are talking of a relationship that dates back from the 1960s. The Chinese were there supporting the liberation struggle. But also during that time, during the colonial time, you find there's a heavy involvement of the global north, as you put it, the USA, the UK, Germany, and other countries from the north that were heavily invested in the mining that was taking place in Zimbabwe. So the transition of which it was supposed to be a decolonial movement, it's still a decolonial movement. 1980, when Zimbabwe gained its independence, you find China almost takes like a backseat because the whole arrangement of the independence is something that's planned by the UK and the US. They choreograph everything. That's the legacy of US diplomats and UK diplomats, and they achieved something that was quite outstanding. But from there, you find the Chinese are sort of pushed to the periphery. But also, what's happening at that time is that the Chinese maintain interaction with the new government. You find significant interaction in the areas of health. Zimbabweans going to China to be trained, and you find people from China also coming to Zimbabwe to offer their professional expertise. You find there's the construction of the National Sports Stadium and other many projects that China will be doing. But these are at a low key. Then something happens around 2000. Zimbabwe has a land reform program, and the relationship with the West goes sour. And now we find we adopt a look East policy. And in the handbook, I say, which some actually have labeled a look China policy, because it mostly emphasizes a focus on China than other countries in the East. Although you find there's a bit of mention of countries like Malaysia here, India here and there, but the main emphasis really is China. So it's something that's happening. And also during that time, 2000, after the land reform, we find that the sanctions on Zimbabwe, there's serious sanctions in terms of access to credit lines, in general doing business. So it's so hard, but China steps in to fill in a void that's been left by the rest of the international community. So Zimbabwe is isolated, but China is in the corner of Zimbabwe. And something simultaneously is happening. You talked about nationalism, the empowerment. There's a serious discourse around indigenization, which is the taking over of farms, of mines, and other businesses on a 51% stake. And so it's something that tends to affect other businesses. But you find there are instances where the Chinese get to be affected by the indigenization policy, and sometimes they waver on whether to invest or not to invest, or whether to pull out or not to pull out. So, but generally they are safe, they are protected. You find other companies really suffer, and other companies make proposals for indigenization plans, but the Chinese companies, they don't suffer that kind of problem. But then in 2009, something happened again that's meaningful. It's another transition in Zimbabwean politics. You find there was a government of national unity. During the government of national unity, at some point, China was not sure what's going to happen. But you find generally there are investments that come into Zimbabwe from China, a lot of investments. But also what's unique about that time is that you find from the West, it is called in Zimbabwe, it's really called the North, but the West, you find there's a lot of re-engagement, a lot of putting in of resources during the time, 2011, 2012. But 2012 is another important transition, because 2013 there was an election. And why we should talk about 2012 is that the election, it was not sure if ZANU-PF, which is the ruling party, was going to remain in power, or the opposition, the MDC, was going to take over. So it was not sure. So for the first time, you find the Chinese push that a loan that they were offering for the renovation of Victoria Falls Airport be taken to Parliament for ratification. And that's important because that's so far about it's probably the only loan from China that has ever been ratified by the Parliament of Zimbabwe. And so we're talking of investments that range into billions. So it's just the investments in the energy sector. You're talking of over 12 billion investments into the energy sector alone. So, but all these investments are investments that have not gone through Parliament. And you find as recent as in December 2020, you find there was a High Court of Zimbabwe judgment instructing the Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe to disclose the terms and conditions of the loans that have the foreign loans, of which they mentioned in particular the ones from Afreximbank, which is the main conduit for funding from China. Something happens after the 2013 election. Mugabe becomes unsure, about the Chinese presence. And that's something that's so unique, and it develops up to 2016 when Mugabe eventually chucks off all Chinese companies that were operating in the diamond sector in a particular place called Chiadzo in Zimbabwe. They were being moved out. You find Chinese companies, Anjin and Jinan, were moved out of that area, and that's an important development. That's in the populous 15 billion claim that Mugabe made, that 15 billion worth of diamonds could not be accounted for. But obviously, there are fact checkers that have said it cannot be 15 billion when they look at the quantities in terms of mining, etc. But that's another discussion. But what's important is that Mugabe stopped the mining. And you find that in another transition, when Mugabe eventually fell down in 2017, the new president that came, he released a list of people and organizations, institutions that were involved in externalization. And one of the companies that was in the top 5 was the Chinese company Jinan for externalizing. So it was on the list. So he began on that note, and if you had followed the transition from Mugabe to the new government, then it was bent on dealing with corruption and criminals, etc. But then that discourse begins to change with time, and as Zimbabwe can say, we are open for business. You find in 2020, you find the Chinese companies are back. They're back again. They're operating in the diamond mining areas. Not Jinan, but Anjin is back. But when you look again at cases that have gone to the High Court of Zimbabwe, you find that the ownership of these companies, it was the same people that owned both companies. So in other words, we are just saying the same companies are back again and doing business in Zimbabwe. And there's another transition that's unique. That's the global factor. The COVID-19 situation. The COVID-19 situation is a big thing again, because you find the prices of minerals have been going up, production has been going down. It just created a unique environment, especially in the mining areas. Because when we visited a lot of mining areas in Zimbabwe around the Great Dyke Belt, we found that there was a lot that the companies were supposed to have done, but was not doing in terms of COVID-19 protection. So this applied to big companies like Hydro, and to smaller unknown companies that were operating in areas like Mutoko and Zushavane. So some of the things that they were not doing was providing masks, providing the rest of the PPEs, and also social protection for workers. But one of the things that we found really alarming, especially in my conversation to some employees from Sino-Hydro, was the issue of being forced to stay on site against their will. So it's something. But also during the field work, something that I picked, and I think it's something that we all need to learn, is that sometimes we might have developed a certain discrimination against the Chinese, or a certain stereotype against the Chinese, and it's something that we needed to treat ourselves as well during the field work, that we don't get to be biased as such. So one of the conclusions, again, we arrived at was the issue of responsible investments. It was mainly coming from that realization that we don't need to carry a stereotype about Chinese investments, etc. So as you're talking about the mining vision, the AMV African Mining Vision, it's important also to highlight some discourses that we saw, I imagine, in Zimbabwe around mine ownership. In Zimbabwe, the idea that there's been attempts to talk about mining as being more than just about the North, the global North intervening in Zimbabwe, but also to try to talk about the pre-colonial time, mining as well. The mining that the Shona were doing, the mining that the Ndebele were doing before the colonial period began. So after that, you find there's a lot of discussion right now in Zimbabwe about the diversity of the mineral sector. You find about 60 key minerals have been identified by the government, and in the handbook we mentioned those, and they've made that a key pillar of the re-engagement agenda. When you check at the Zimbabwe Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, you find they put it out there that we possess this. And partly it's because Zimbabwe is looking for investors. That's the policy. We are open for business. We're open for business. We're looking for investors to come and mine. And the Chinese have always been the investor that has stood up. But Zimbabwe is also saying, no, we need to diversify investors into the varied mineral sector. There's also a discussion about ownership that's happening in Zimbabwe, because it's almost difficult to tell who owns what in the mining field. During our field work, when we went, we saw some small Chinese places or Chinese mining sites that are not, speaking from the community side, from the chiefs that we spoke to, are not registered by EMA, or at least the EMA process, the Environmental Management Agents process in terms of EIAs was not done. So these are places that are almost hardly known. And so I think it's about 3 or so years Zimbabwe commissioned a certain process of getting together data on who is doing what, where, and how are they doing it. But it's that process is still to yield anything. And I think in the last budget, or the Zimbabwe national budget, the Minister of Finance as well spoke a lot about something like that. But it's still been something that people are talking about, some sort of database, but it's failing to materialize, which is also leads to one of our recommendations, that perhaps there's need for people from civil society, non-state organizations, to try to come up with an alternative database, a database that can then be used to argue that this is happening there, this is happening there. Because a lot is happening, but a lot is unknown. That's something. Then there's also, in 2014, Mugabe launched a Sovereign Wealth Fund. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, which was supposed to be funded by royalties from minerals, but nothing had been deposited until last year, when 100 million allocation was made towards the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So it's something. It's a discourse again that's ongoing. So I just want now to turn a bit to chrome, gold, and diamonds, and just make some few highlights. So these 2 chapters are 100 pages, and I'm doing my best to just make a summary here. So you find the Chinese are mainly involved in Zimbabwe with the three major chrome companies. We talk of Zisco Steel, Zimasco, and Zim Alloy. And what's interesting about some of these companies is that they are registered overseas. They're not registered in Zimbabwe. They're registered in Mauritius, for example, in the case of Zimasco. And some of them have their headquarters in the Cayman Islands. It's all something that's very instructive about the nature of investments that are happening in the chrome sector. So there is a search for investors that's happening for Zisco Steel in particular. The government of Zimbabwe, at some point, the Chinese offered to assist, but still the government of Zimbabwe is failing to come to terms, especially on the indigenization clauses. Because when the transition from Mugabe happened, the government had said, we are going to move away from the 51% requirement for all minerals. And we are going to say only for diamond and platinum. But you find in the case of Zisco Steel, the Chinese investors were promised the first 100%, then that 100% was revised to 48%, and they stepped back. So it's something that's also interesting. There is also the issue of small scale chrome miners, and it's an issue that's a sore for many chrome miners in the areas of Shabani. You find they don't have the capacity in terms of equipment to mine the chrome and then to process it. So the Chinese, they do sort of a contract farming kind of model where they loan you they don't really give you, but they come to do it for you. They take they mine for you, they extract for you. Then you are supposed to get about 20 or 30% from that. The pricing there is problematic as well. It's actually way, way, way lower than what they would actually get when they sell through the official procedure of the MMCZ, which is the minerals marketing platform in Zimbabwe. But you find still people would rather, these owners of these mine claims would rather deal with the Chinese because of the problems that are associated with official channels like paperwork, etc. And the same problem actually manifests when you talk about gold as well, where you find a lot of gold is being mined by small scale gold miners, and the small scale gold miners also have a problem of where to sell the gold. So eventually they go to sell on the black market where they get their payments quickly. But what's also unique about the gold case is the issue of a company which was owned by the Chinese, which is called the ASA Resources. So ASA Resources was suspended from the London Stock Exchange for malpractices and also externalizing and actually shipping out raw ore from Zimbabwe. But then ASA Resources was bought by Frederick Becker, Goldmine, and Frederick Becker had also problems at court again, where it was reviewed. Also, it was owned by a lot of Chinese business. At Frederick Becker, the ownership of that company, which was so much of Chinese, was eventually stopped by the government. And what is really interesting about this time is that there is one businessman who is called Kudakwashe Tagirei, who is also linked to all these. For diamonds, I had spoken about Anjin and Jinan having come back. And also I should say that there's a lot of presence in terms of the military being involved with Anjin, and actually the military, according to a parliamentary inquiry, the military owned a 40% stake in Anjin, and as they are back in the mining of diamonds at Chiadzo, there are problems to do with violence against the community. That's there. So I'll list some of the things that we observed as well coming from the community. There were labor issues that the community raised in terms of low salaries, absence of social protection, absence of registration with official bodies like the National Social Security Agency, NASA. You find also the community complained a lot about desecration of sacred sites. There were also cultural clashes, sometimes the community complaining about the Chinese bathing in rivers where women usually and other people can access, like in public places. And people spoke also about damage to infrastructure, including their houses and roads that have been damaged. So, by way of conclusion, well, some of the things that we thought were contributing to animosity between Chinese investments in the mining sector and generally in Zimbabwe. We felt mainly a result of the opacity, of a lack of understanding of knowledge of what China is doing in Zimbabwe. And we recommend that the Chinese, especially in light of the Vision 2030, that they have to try by all means to make some of their activities visible. Then we also made a recommendation around social inclusion, that as much as possible to try to involve citizens, organizations, not necessarily just the state, as is the current way. So my last issue that we had was the issue of responsible investments and better structuring of investments. So this is like a twin process. We are saying on the part of China, there is issue of responsible investments, but then on the part of the Zimbabwean government, there is the issue of better structuring of investments. They need, yes, I know the country is in a desperate situation, but it is better to actually better structure the investments. So all this, the lack of what's happening on the ground. People don't know what's happening on the ground. And I think it's important to actually get to have more about what's happening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prolific. Sorry to cut you short. I was quite listening attentively to that and would have wished you could keep talking. And I'm just going to move over to the next speaker. And in this regard, we've had quite a bit of what Prolific spoke to, and we're looking now at what our institutional capacities can they handle this kind of circumstances? Because you spoke to strategies to circumvent this, and thank you for not just giving us the problem, but also proposing ways to actually improve on this. And you spoke to the aspects to CSRs, and you spoke to aspects that actually touch on our institutional capacities in terms of their capability and strategies that can be implemented to circumvent the challenges around responsible investment from Chinese companies in Africa, in Africa and in Zimbabwe in particular. And thank you for actually speaking to the perceptions that can cloud what is actually happening on the ground where sufficient information is not given. Titus, I'll ask you to weigh in here because both Dennis and Prolific have spoken quite a bit to the political aspects that have to do with the political economy. They have spoken to institutional capacity. They have spoken to the governance in the sector without explicitly stating it as that. And when we come back to looking at where we're anchoring our discussion on, we realize that quite a lot that's actually stipulated on the AMV has been flaunted a bit in terms of the nature of relations that have been established, and also in terms of actually we look at the fact that the AMV is actually a policy document. There are some implementation plans, but from both perspectives, what we hear is that the implementation of those policies where they are there is also lacking. So perhaps from your experiences, we know that the AMV is not a foolproof policy document, but we know that it's actually, at least we acknowledge that it has set strategies towards realizing the potential of the extractive sector, the true potential, at least for the African continent and for Zimbabwe in specifically. So can you please speak to the role that the political economy plays on the discourse of the growing Chinese investments in the region, specifically to Zimbabwe? And are we looking at a replay of the past year to the times when we had, Prolific called it the West, I call it the global North? Are we looking at a replay of that scenario, or are we looking at a West off scenario? What's your take on this?
Thanks very much. And colleagues from my fellow panelists, and other colleagues from all of it. Indeed, I will speak to that. In short, I will speak on what we could actually learn, because what China has done is actually impressive, as we will show. And for me, the question is, what can Africa learn at a political, institutional, and practical level? And do likewise. I mean, at the end of the day, you want a relationship that is mutually beneficial, that is win-win. And so I will speak to all those issues. I will definitely refer to the Africa Mining Vision, but you will notice that it is a strategy, it is a plan, and those things are implemented within the context of broader reality of the country or a reality of the continent. So I will try to be broad and unpack those issues at the political economy level. So yeah, I will breeze through like some notes quickly. I will sort of restate in a minute or so the Chinese mining footprint on the continent, and I'll briefly unpack what the nature of our relationship is. And I'll spend the bulk of my 10 or so minutes on lessons and recommendations. As you're all aware, in China, perhaps it is the big economy that seems more interested in investing in the mining economy of Africa. And just to give you an example, in 2011, China controlled about 10 mining operations on the continent, and this figure went to 24 by 2018. That speaks to exponential growth in terms of its own mining footprint on the continent. Of course, China's interest is in mining resources, and on one hand, it's motivated by interest in mining resources, and of course, continued strong growth in power, construction, industrial manufacturing sectors, and of course, its own declining internal mining production capacity year on, and also declining ore grades. Some of the ore grades that are in China have become, less optimal, and so it's going to new markets to get better quality. Labor costs have also increased. The more stringent regulatory environment has increased in China, and so some investors just want to go elsewhere and try. So it's not surprised that Chinese mining investors have looked to Africa for investment in mining. After all, Africa has an abundance of these high-grade natural resources. So you will find gold everywhere, but sometimes the quality and the ease of access is different. Look at the Mozambique natural gases quality and stuff like that. So it's also about the quality and presence of certain resources, low cost, cobalt, lithium, and stuff like that. I won't repeat because I'm sure it's been mentioned in the first PEDNAC and of course colleagues we just met. So you're looking at an economy of about 15 to 16 trillion, and ours being around 3 trillion. That's a massive difference. Now, to be specific, South and Central Africa appear to be the jurisdictions that are attracting the lion's share of interest of Chinese investors. In fact, I would mention 3 countries, which are South Africa, Zambia, and DRC. These are major interest areas for China in terms of mining. Because of the high-grade cobalt deposits in the Congo and Sierra Leone. I'm not saying those are the only countries with Chinese mining investors, Zimbabwe and a couple of, but these are truly large options. West Africa as well, because of rich gold and aluminium resources. So it's a whole range of resources they are interested in. So, but it's not just economic and mining. It is important to understand the other key driver of China and Africa, which is China's ambition in Africa to enhance intergovernmental collaboration between China and African countries. Hence, you have FOCAC, which is the Forum for China and China Cooperation, which I think is a very important platform for CSOs to look at. And of course, increased implementation of BRI initiative, which we referred to from the last PEDNAC. Now, we see, because of COVID, a bit of a decline in lending. I think China is not Father Christmas anymore. They've reduced lending. We don't think it's going to cease, but you will see a China that's more selective in 21 and 22 going onward. So the 2 main policy banks in China, which have been giving out loans, the China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, you will see a rise of more private equity within China and state enterprises, but not so much these 2. But there will still be enough, for Africa to look at. But the key thing is you will find a much more selective and choosy China from this year onwards, and that's important. China is also trying to diversify its sourcing of raw materials so as to avoid regional dependence on certain resources, and that is important in terms of Africa's ability to put its house in order. No one is waiting for us. If we don't put our act together, I mean, the investment will go elsewhere, or partnerships will go elsewhere. For example, China is moving towards Gulf countries, Americas, Russia for oil. But of course, we'll see imports into Africa remaining robust, especially around local suppliers of processed goods across the continent. Now, in terms of the nature of our relationship, I would say Zimbabwe's export profile, I think, best encapsulates the China-Africa relationship, because it's dominated by raw materials. You know, it comes to China, it's your cash crops, your tobacco, your cotton, your minerals, nickel, copper, platinum, and coal. So in a sense, you know, sometimes we think there's something unique there about Africa and China. China or Zimbabwe economic relations with China are not different from any other nation, in a sense. How we have engaged with England or with the US has been export of raw materials. You know, we are the guys who dig and import and export. That has always been what we do. And that's the caricature of the type of economic relations constructed during colonialism, and it's continuing. And importation of finished goods. This is what defines Sino-Zimbabwean economic ties long-standing. I mean, the other side, of course, that defines our relationship is the political cooperation dating back from the colonial era. Countries like Zimbabwe are unique, as you know, from the liberation struggle to the Cold War to the sanctions era. So when you look at sometimes, China negotiating, say, a chrome contract with an African country, I mean, it's not just about chrome. It's also negotiating a friendship that dates back decades, which is why sometimes the conditions are secret, because we are not just negotiating a basic resource, we are negotiating how our friendship should continue. So when Zimbabwe scratches your back, China during the Tiananmen Square in 1980s, China scratches also Zimbabwe's back, sometimes by throwing chrome, diamonds, and stuff like that. So this relationship is convoluted and it's complex. And the question, though, is what does it mean for us? What can we learn? Sometimes as NGOs, I think we worry so much about policy, which is good, but we forget that we should equally worry about people behind the policy. We have to worry about the paradigm that governs the policy. We have to worry about the politics and the process to get to where we want. And that's what I want to speak to as well. Not just the policy, which is AMV, but the people, the paradigm, the policy process. Now, and to do that, I want to mention that FOCAC, this year is the 20th anniversary of FOCAC, the China-Africa Cooperation. And the first time we had COPAC, it was 20 years ago. I mean, the economy of Africa was half the size of China. Now, in the 20th anniversary of FOCAC, the size of Africa's economy is now 1/5 of Chinese economy. Now, we've been talking COPAC, meeting at FOCAC every year, but one partner has grown much larger than the other. Why is that the case? I think for me, that's the crucial question with us. And for me, the first thing is, and I keep saying this everywhere I go, is you need a capable African state, capable in character and capacity. And this is what should interest us in society. Sometimes in society, if you work in extractives, you get so interested in just updating the mining law on free prime. In other words, on minute policy or legal issues. And you forget that for this to work, this has to work in the context of a capable entrepreneurial and democratic state. And so that's always the thing that should govern the way we look at it. We are, as CSOs, working towards strengthening capacity, innovation, and nature of the African states. So we want that capacity to generate, capacity to manage, capacity to spend revenue, competent, capacity to monitor, compliance, flush out evasion, negotiate agreements, deal with communities, deal with private sector. So it's a multi-layered issue of capacity, which goes beyond our own sector. Our own sector is just but one of them. That is a crucial aspect of it. The second one is the imperative of leadership. Of policies, everything rises and falls on leadership. This is John Maxwell. And for China, I think there's no place to learn about the value of leadership than China. I mean, look at the role of Chairman Deng Xiaoping. I mean, his role in dismantling the former order that Mao Zedong had established to something much more pragmatic. You can't talk about China's transformation right now without mentioning the specific leadership of Deng Xiaoping and the coordination and the synchronized nature of the leadership of China from the late 70s. Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin. How the leadership of China and the Communist Party is crucial in explaining its role, and is crucial in explaining how the mining architecture has been advantageous. And so for us, we worry about extractivism, we have to worry about Africa mining vision. I want us to worry about leadership as well. But we need to think, support, develop the kind of leadership that mirrors the success that we have seen beyond that. You look at Xi Jinping, it's very different from Deng Xiaoping. But the same thing is you have leadership who continue progressive policies of the other. What we are seeing on the continent right now, even with the extractivists, one president comes, he declares 5% royal tax. The other one comes, he says, I don't want to be outdone. He scraps. So there's confusion. New president, new blueprint. You remove things that don't even need to be removed. Sometimes you even change streets that are not even necessary in some countries. And so the question is, what is the question of leadership at all levels? At the central government level, at state enterprises, in NGOs, at revenue authorities, at the border control, the institution of leadership is going to be important. Leadership that sets goals, that's visionary, that comes up with blueprints that are followed right up to the street. I'll give you the sonic type of leadership which we have seen on the continent, where leaders are more caught up with the short term, where the proverbial Esau who wanted soup instead of his birthright. We have those kinds of leaders now who would rather get money from diamonds or from copper and invest it in an election or invest it in something more short term. But what we want are leaders who are long term, who invest in infrastructure that doesn't benefit them in 2 years, but that benefits generation 20, 30 years. So yes, leadership is going to be crucial. The next thing is, of course, we'll need to develop strategies that fast-track achievement of key enablers for regional industrialization. That's your integration, harmonization of policies. And what COVID has done is to emphasize this point. I think COVID has not taught us anything new. It is, I think, accentuating inequalities that we know. It is accentuating lessons that we've always known. And one of them is the urgency of economic structural change is crucial for transformation. We can't continue to ship out raw materials, to supply raw materials, but what we need is to deepen, move from local to regional content in order to build resilience to global shocks. And beyond local content, we are talking about reshoring some value chains where it is feasible to do that. And the next key thing that we have to think about is really leveraging the Africa size. What William will talk about regional approaches now. What China has done is to use its population 1.4 and the vast size, which is continental, for its advantage within the extractive sector. And Africa has to do the same thing. We also are large in size, collective population, natural resource worth, and we have to begin to do that. When we focus on our small individual units, we are too small to meaningfully engage. What China has done to its advantage is this one continent-sized country, whereas in Africa, of course, we have 50 plus individual units, all driven by some president and domestic imperatives that are different from everyone else. So how can we leverage our size to negotiate better on the continent? This is where leadership comes in. This is where CSO, media, academics, publics should matter. That we have to make this an election issue, which is regional approaches. We have to make the AFCTA, which allows us to wield power of the single market in a manner akin to China doing over the last 20 years. So moving from national level negotiations for contracts to regional level negotiations, say platinum, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana for diamonds. Let's do that at a national level. Regional value chains. I mean, we're going to talk about hydrogen fuel cell, which is crucial for the green economy. That for hydrogen fuel cell energy solutions, you need platinum as your catalyst. Now, if South Africa and Zimbabwe combine to basically launch a massive hydrogen fuel cell economy, we could talk about, two countries that are rich in platinum going places. Same thing with phosphate, one of my favorite examples, that, Africa lacks phosphate fertilizers. On average, Africa uses 8 kilograms per hectare of phosphate fertilizer, versus the world average of 107 kilograms of fertilizer. Yet we have all the components of fertilizer on this continent, your magnesium, your manganese, your potassium, your sulfides, but we don't have the fertilizer to use it here. What we could do is a regional value chain for phosphate fertilizer. And when we do that, we're using extractives to actually increase productivity in agriculture. That's one way of diversifying, but that's one way of leveraging our size to launch Africa into development. So we must invest, even as CSOs, in strengthening regional and multi-country approaches. We must invest in strengthening institutions that focus on multilateralism. And we must invest in leaders who are serious about regional approaches. We have to make this an election issue, like I was saying. So gone are the days of leaders who just say, I want to grow the economy, I want to, democracy. I want to know what a leader thinks about regional approaches. I want to see what a leader thinks about Pan-Africanism. This is crucial for elections. This is crucial for the future of the African economy. Leaders who think beyond their own nation and say, we want to unite and work for the betterment of our extractive sector. I want to give you an example. In 2012, African Union was formally brought into FOCA, as the African Union, and to recognize its role on the continent. 3 years later, only 3 years later, China had a permanent residence office in Addis Ababa to nurture the AU relationship. But for AU, it took until 2018, 3 years after, for AU to have a permanent residence in Beijing. That tells you that in terms of regionalism or regional approach, we are still taking too long. And this is part of the reason why we are not maximizing and leveraging our side. Now, I want to get too much into the governance architecture because I think we've done a lot of it, strength and transparency and accountability, pillars of democratic governance. And in that, I think pushing around the full implementation of AMV is going to be crucial. Moving from AMV to SADC AMV as well. But more crucially, if you ask me, the issue is not just on that strategy, but it's to invest in understanding and removing endogenous and exogenous factors that affect how a country is run. Meaning taking seriously the aspect of international geopolitics and how it's affecting how we do work here. But there is no country that is going to help us reshore any value chain. There is no country that's going to help Africa industrialize. There is no interest in allowing that to happen. And so look at ourselves as the end it all, that we have to do it locally. No matter how much you can throw up some nice strategy and implement it, we have to do this as a continent because no one is going to help us become independent. And so understanding the endogenous and exogenous factors that affect how a country is run is going to be crucial. What has not been maybe mentioned quite more aggressively is, I think when it comes to China and Africa, I think the key thing for us is to push for tech transfer for green revolution. Technological transfer should be crucial in negotiations with China, not just export of raw materials. Right now, no African country is in the top 15 of lithium-ion battery supply chain rankings. The next country that is on these rankings is China, South Africa, which is 19, and DRC, which is, I think, the 24th. And I'll say, of course, Africa exports 90% of its iron ore, but it imports majority of its steel for domestic use from China. So then the question is, when countries like Zimbabwe boast of having a special relationship with China, and yet we emerge without special tech capabilities, beyond tracking, sometimes otherwise ineffective activists, then what are we talking about? What I'm saying in terms of our relationship with China is we have to bring ambition to our special relationship with China as Zimbabwe and, of course, as an African country. So far, we have not managed to unlock any meaningful technological relationship through our relationship with China. What we have are African leaders who are accepting stadiums for chrome. We are accepting election vehicles for oil. This is not how ambition looks like to me. That winning some parliamentary seat is more important than chrome reserves. I think we have to bring ambition to this and ensure that the relationship includes transfer of meaningful capacity. Now, why is this important? Because processing capacity for minerals is now more important than having the resource in the ground. I keep telling colleagues, having lithium in Doroa, having lithium in Bigita minerals is less important than having the capacity to process the lithium-ion battery. So what we need is that technological capacity so that we have both the advantage of having the resource and the processing capacity from graphite, lithium, cobalt. It's meaningless to have all of that unless you can process it. So African governments must invest a portion of revenue towards R&D towards education, improving regulatory environment, and support innovation. We don't talk about a democratic state now. We talk about an entrepreneurial, innovative state, which is what you see with US. Right now, China is the largest investor in clean energy. Countries like Germany, Qatar, we have to be leaders in investing in clean energy. You have sun 365 days, but you have no technology to harvest it except importing solar panels from somewhere. Now, we have an example of WITS. WITS University is formerly the South Africa School of Mines. So mining could actually be a place which can catalyze the education of a country and the improved technological revolution within a country. Now, South Africa is not accidental. That is now the top 10 mining equipment supplier worldwide. It's because of that deliberate nature, intentionality in how they deal with technology. My last point is, when it comes to our relationship with China, centrality of community, sustainability, and agency is crucial. Now, increasingly, China-Africa economic cooperation will be defined by the need to not just grow, but to grow sustainably. And within 1996, the UNDP produced a report that we have to guard against the ruthless growth, soulless growth, jobless growth. We want to grow sustainably. This is pertinent in a post-COVID era where most of our countries, the emphasis isn't just about economic recovery. Now it's about using COVID as an inflection point to build economies that are more inclusive. So Africa and China should explore this by ensuring greater uptake of green bonds, for example, to finance sustainable business and infrastructure, or promoting dialogue with policymakers and businesses on improved policy and, regulatory measures. Of course, promote inclusive economic activities, respect community agencies. We know because there is no World Bank money or IMF money, the question around what to do with communities is very difficult. Because when a small Chinese company comes, like when a big Chinese company like Sino comes and we say negotiate with community, no, what is negotiating with community is not just Sino, but it is the state. What is the state company? So the power asymmetries are so significant that we have to take it as urgent, the aspect of respecting community agents. So laws respecting people and informed consent, laws ensuring that we have proper labor rights are crucial. Why is this important? Because poverty is literally growing around mining activities. In fact, we don't have poor people around mining towns. We have super poor people. They were poor before mining. Now they've become super poor because they've lost their land, they've bad air, they have all kinds of things. And so we have to make sure that the community aspect is properly negotiated. One such measure is to make sure that we de-risk mechanisms for green investment and things like that. So ensuring sustainability, ensuring community agents, and ensuring that we respect these rights should be one of the key things that govern how we relate with China. But above all, like I said, if we see anything we can learn from China, it's leadership. I can round down as a conclusion that the African state matters, a capable state that can investigate, negotiate, and control its territories and enemy. The number two I said is leadership matters. Leadership is crucial at a multi-level or in different spheres, NGOs, state enterprises for mining, revenue authorities, port authorities. Leadership is going to matter. Size will matter. William Go, size of Africa matter, and how we work as one unit in negotiating for contracts, in doing regional value chains is going to be crucial. Your governance is going to matter, Africa. Implement what you create and make sure that you're more transparent in your negotiating. Technology and R&D issues matter. I think we have to leverage our closeness, our close political relationship, and unlock more progressive technology, not surveillance technology only for intelligence organization. No. But mining technology that will help us process your lithium, your granite, your cobalt, so technology matters. And the last but not least, rights are going to matter in how we relate with this country, with China and every other country. We cannot sacrifice women's rights, labor rights, community rights at the altar of something supposedly called economic growth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Titus. And you then summarized your very key points at the end. So I do not think I need to be replaying that one. I will just pick on a few threads that really touched the core on my side. It's the issue of visionary ethical leadership, the issue of capacity, the issue of maximizing on scales of economy by working regionally, the issue of innovation, technology and innovation, and harnessing the opportunities that come with the green revolution. And all those are really central issues to how we can navigate really strengthening the relations between Africa and China, as well as maximizing our benefits from those relations if we manage to strengthen our capacity in that. We have initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Areas that are still relatively new, and we're yet to see what we can benefit out of those, or whether or not we have sufficient investment in infrastructure to actually drive those initiatives, because they will not happen on their own. Prolific, could you perhaps come back to us and speak about the strategies that you spoke to and what role citizens can play in terms of actually driving change in the sector? What's the role of citizens, civil organizations, NGOs? How do we navigate this space? Can we drive any change in the sector from that perspective?
Thank you, Tanezili. What has to be done? I think I like the Titus's, interventions, because they spoke to the greater political context in the country. Recently, there was a National Citizens Convention that was held in Zimbabwe, and one of the themes was that community is the answer. Whatever problem it is, community is the answer. And I think it's really one of the tasks that has to happen, to educate communities around their rights in terms of what's happening within them, providing ways of them communicating to broader stakeholders outside their immediate concerns about what's happening within their locality. But I think from my research, what I found to be something that's very important is how a lot of things happen in the dark. There's a problem about the dark when it comes to Chinese investments. And as citizens, as organizations, in particular as organizations in this country, I think it's important to have an initiative that tries to take stock about what's happening, where and how. So to provide a platform for citizens to even try to raise an issue around. So we need to focus on what China is doing, to try to understand what it is doing. Where is it doing? What is it doing? Then by so doing, cascade that to Parliament, empower the parliamentarians with information about what is happening in Mtoko, where a particular, probably member of Parliament could be of a particular party, and there's a bit of collusion around, or a lot of collusion, and therefore maintain this black box thing. So we need to bust that. And the best way to bust that is to provide information around the laws, around labor malpractices. It's so useful. I've seen cases where Zela has taken or has threatened to take certain companies, mining companies, including Chinese companies, to court. And the reaction has been positive, and you found improvements in terms of real improvements, in terms of working conditions for workers and community. In cases of environmental pollution with diamond mining in Zimbabwe, where you find litigation has really played an important role. So I think it's important to emphasize tracking the investments, collecting what's happening. And I think it's something for me that I think will be a game changer in terms of, so the handbook we did is just a start. And like I said, the things were so tentative, but it's a start that needs to be built from into something that's much more lasting, something that can influence policy in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Prolific. I will transition to Titus. On that note, you spoke to quite a bit about human rights being flaunted in Peru. And we have a question here from Tuso to Titus. By the way, he enjoyed your presentation very much. And he is asking, to what extent the AMV is equipped to deal with or address the irresponsible investment from China and other investors. And before I leave that question to you, Titus, I will do what I do best, double barrel that by providing a bit of context, because we know that some of one of the tenets from the AMV, it's got about 7 of those, and one of those is fostering sustainable development principles based on environmentally and socially responsible mining, which is safe and includes communities and all other stakeholders. So we know that from a policy perspective, the AMV has provided guidance on some of those issues. It touches on ASM, it touches on almost just about everything that we have covered here, which echoes Titus's earlier sentiments that in some instances, policies are there, but what can actually be done from an implementation perspective? How can those challenges be addressed? Would you perhaps comment on that, Titus?
Okay, thanks, President. Yeah, that's a great question, which doesn't have one answer. We often want one answer to address something as complex as Africa. What you're talking about, how do we hold Chinese companies accountable in every sense of the word? And I think we do that through a multiplicity of strategies working together. And I have to emphasize that it's not these strategies separately, but they have to be working together. And of course, when you're talking about transparency, of course, will help. It will help in the sense that I think it will expose the bad stuff to the public and to the world and to other investors in a Chinese project. You will notice that China is now getting into joint ventures, some Western companies, some Eastern companies, and some of the Chinese partners may not necessarily be happy with that irresponsibility. So when you have a transparency regime, exposing that could help, but that's not in itself enough. One of the things that we also have to do is what we did here in Mozambique with a certain well-known celebrity. I mean, she acts in Hollywood, and I think if I mentioned one of the films, you would know because she starred in it. So she was an ambassador for one of our minerals here, precious minerals of Mozambique, and that same mine, very bad thing to happen. So what we did was to engage her, not in Mozambique, but in Hollywood. In a matter of days, she had abandoned, and she's now helping to work in ensuring that that mine is more accountable. What I'm trying to say is sometimes we have to engage personalities, companies, states in their own territory. We have mastered this art with Western companies, right? If an Australian company is doing something bad, it is possible to take the fight to Australia, where the Australian public may not necessarily be fine. Now, one of the misconceptions that people have is the Chinese government itself or Chinese investors in Beijing support this irresponsibility that's happening. Sometimes it's not always the case. In fact, you will remember what I mentioned, that some of the investment is leaving China because of tighter regulatory environment. So some of China's environmental laws are stricter in China than they are outside. And so when you take the fight to China itself, through business, through Chinese Chamber of Commerce, through the provinces, you'll be surprised of the victories you might have. The challenge that I'm noticing is our countries, our CSOs, our media, just doesn't have the influence and capacity to engage China. First, we don't know the language. Second, we don't know the culture. Third, we've never been to their universities. Third, we have no contacts. So we assume it. But we have to improve our influencing capacity with China. We want to see trips going to China. Everybody has been to London, to Washington, to Antwerp, to Melbourne. Let's see those trips to Beijing, to Hong Kong, to Taiwan. Let's engage them in that territory, and see if we can combine transparency, you combine engaging China within China. Let's also combine the regional approaches aspect that I've talked about. When you have a regional platform, you have a stronger platform to negotiate. Because part of the things that we call irresponsibility, it's actually engraved in contracts with these countries. A company that behaves well in China, in Sweden, comes to Zimbabwe and doesn't behave. And sometimes the secret is in the contract itself, which doesn't bind them to do anything. And so I think it starts with the negotiation. To make our guys have stronger negotiating platform is through the regional approaches. But that doesn't work together. The last point I would mention is part of what leadership does is there are unique leaders for unique moments. And I do believe that you need institutions, you need everything. But I do believe you need leaders. Now, I don't agree with the late Magufuli on vaccine, on punishing civil society. But there's one thing that I admired was he was a leader who didn't have problems calling out another country or another company that wasn't doing. And I want our nice guys, our nice leaders to grow a bit of a spine in holding some of this. We have not seen people disappear as much as we have been told. So leaders should also have spine. Engage, analyze better ownership patterns, funders. It's no longer China funding one project. Sometimes it's China, Exim Bank, and maybe European Service Bank or Asia Development Bank. Analyze funding and engage funders in specific projects to hold that community accountable. Now, my last point, and this maybe I don't know, this is something to think about in a space like this. IMF and World Bank are backing EITI. They will say, you will never find this, written sometimes officially. Often you need to implement EITI to get a certain level of support, particularly if you are resource-rich. Why can't African Development Bank do the same with AMV? I do think that you need backing of the AMV with the crucial Pan-African bodies on the continent, whether it's AU is doing it, but it's not giving it meaningful money. We want AFDB to put skin into the game. We know the African Resources National Center is supporting technically, and it's not a land lending, it's not a lending institution. But I want to see financial backing of the AMV from African Development Bank. And let's see if that also increases the team of AMV and companies' ability to be holding this accountable.
Thank you very much for that, Titus. Quite enlightening and quite informative as well. If you could perhaps comment on the devolution policy in Zimbabwe, I would throw that to either Titus or Prolific. Any of you that can hear me, please go for that.
So the devolution discourse in the country is also something that's crazy itself and very contested about the nature of devolution that's happening, whether it's devolution or something else. But you can see there's a lot of politics around. But I think what's important is, in the question is, do we have a process of highlighting to Chinese investors? Do we have a process of enforcing policy to Chinese investors? Because, for example, I'll talk about issues to do with working hours, other issues, labor practices in the country. The Chinese are fully aware of this. But I think just like any corporates, they are making the most out of policies and weak enforcement. And the problem is really a serious problem of the state capture. When you have the Chinese doing everything that they are doing in cahoots, or to use that word, with the state, the mechanisms for enforcement become weak. But I think this is why I keep emphasizing that we need more voices outside that are speaking about what's happening, that are getting the facts out about what's happening. In that way, it could actually help the enforcers in terms of the state, the anti-corruption agencies, environmental agencies, to actually do something and act on something that's so systemic within the country. So devolution could be an opportunity, but I think the opportunities there are very limited. If you understand the whole discourse of devolution from 2013, it's really a limited frame. But there are so many opportunities, and this is why such platforms like this one are important, because they highlight to us some important processes in governmental processes that we as members that are outside these organizations can actually influence, can have conversations around, and we can say, hey, what's happening? Or I think we can actually do these things better. And also, I think just to weigh in on what Teta said about skills development, currently in the country, there's a new educational policy that's been implemented. And I think it's a good move in terms of strengthening the skills capability within the country, and also knowing that Pamush University, the Pan-African Minerals University of Science and Technology, which is something that has been set up. I think it's also important to try to influence the curricula, what is taught there, and to see what kind of research and collaborations can be done in terms of enriching skills and accountability, governance, and benefit for communities. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Prolific. We have 4 minutes to go. And my comment was going to be one that speaks to the aspects to do with the need for driving innovation within the continent and the fact that we're still very much focused on our primary resources, yet countries like China and the developed countries are moving on to processing secondary resources. So this enclave nature of our industry and our dependence on primary resources might see us suffer in the long run. I suppose that's where visionary leadership comes in and good capacity development. On that note, it is 6 o'clock according to my time. I would like to thank the panelists for all the insights given, and to Farai, I cross over back to you for your closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, Farai has faced some network challenges and has dropped off from the call. But my name is Josephine Chiname, and I'm also with the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for the moderation, Thandazile. It was quite an engaging session, and I would like to thank our panelists for sharing their vast knowledge on the subject matter with us. I would like to thank our partners, International Senior Lawyers Project, for partnering with us on this convening. And finally, I would like to thank our partners, the Ford Foundation. This dialogue would not have been possible without their support.
That was one of the political economy dialogues on natural resource governance, PEDNAG, brought to you by the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, and the Africa Institute for Environmental Law. For more information, please check out www.zela.org or follow the African Institute for Environmental Law on Twitter at AIEL_info. Stay tuned for more episodes.